Let's talk now about the use of the if function in Excel. The if function is one of those items that I think makes Excel particularly useful and allows it just to be far more versatile than it would be without the if function. Normally, when we type something into a cell, if it's text or if it's a date, that is what appears in the cell. If we type a formula into a cell, then the results of that formula will appear in the cell. However, if we use an if function, then we can have alternate possibilities of what will appear in that cell. Let's go through some examples first. Let's go to cell A1 and let's type in sales. And let's say my sales are $15,000. Let's go to A2 and type in message. And what we want to do then in cell B2 is to insert a function that will give either a happy message if our sales are above, let's say, $10,000, or a sad message if our sales are below $10,000. Now there's two ways to insert the function. One is we can just start typing equals if, left parentheses, and then fill in the variables for that. But I find that for students it's much easier if we were to go here instead and click on the FX where it says insert function, and it will guide us through the steps in entering this function. It happens to be the very first one on my list that it pulls up. If it were not, I could come here where it says type in a brief description. I could type in if, tell it to go, and it would pull up all the ones which use the if. So here's the one I want. And I pull it up, and what I want you to see is there are three parts to the if. The first part is called the logical test. The logical test is some sort of a comparison. It may be less than, greater than, equal to, or not equal to, but we have to compare two items. Those typically are going to be cell references, although they could be numbers typed in. Now in our case, the deciding factor about whether or not we're going to give a happy message or a sad message has to do with whether our sales are greater than $10,000. So I can say, since my sales amount is in B1, my test can be if B1 is greater than 10,000. Notice over here to the right, it automatically tells you that that condition right now is true. If that is true, what do we want to do? Give them a happy message. I'm going to say congratulations. So the first box is the test, some sort of a comparison, less than, greater than, equal to, not equal to. The second box is the what to do if the condition is true. What do you want to show in this cell if the condition is true? The third box says, what do you want to show in this cell if this condition is false? So in our case, if sales are not greater than 10,000, we want to give the not so happy message. Maybe we'll say, please work harder. Let's tell it okay. And notice right now in cell B1, B2, we are getting the happy message. Let's go back to cell B1 and change my sales to just be 5,000. And notice now that I'm getting the not so happy message. By using the if function, we have two different possibilities of what could appear in that cell. Now let me mention with that function, I actually typed in the number 10,000. Maybe that 10,000 cutoff is something that this month it might be 10,000, it might be 12,000 next month, it might be 6,000 the next month. If that were the case, if that 10,000 were something that's subject to change as your point of comparison from one period to the next, we could instead put that into a cell somewhere and then compare to that cell instead. That'd make things even more versatile. Let's go to sheet 2 and let's go through another example. Let's now calculate the amount of my sales commissions. So again in A1, let's type in the word sales. And then in A2, let's type in low rate. And then in A3, let's type in high rate. Let's go back to cell B1 and let's say again my sales are $15,000. Let's say if my sales are low, we're going to give them a 5% commission, so I'll type that into B2. And if my sales are high, I'm going to give them a 8% commission, and I'll type that into cell B3. Now what we want to do is to go to cell A4 and type in commission amount, in that column. And the way we're going to calculate the commission is this. If my sales are above 10,000, then we'll pay them a commission of the sales times the high rate. If my sales are not above 10,000, then we'll pay them a commission, which is the sales times the low rate. In B4, we want to insert an if function, so we'll go to fx, we'll select if. Here's my test. Again, my cutoff period is if my sales are greater than $10,000. All right, so my condition is going to be if B1 is greater than 10,000. If B1 is greater than 10,000, then I'm going to pay them at the high rate. So what do I want to appear in the cell if that condition is true? Well, it would be my sales times my high rate, which is in cell B3. Notice I just pointed and clicked for the cells. I could type in the cell reference instead. Either way is just fine. Value if false. In other words, if my sales are not greater than 10,000. If they're not greater than 10,000, in other words, if they're less than or equal to 10,000, what am I going to do for sales commission? Well, now it will be my sales times the low rate. Notice at the beginning it tells me what about my condition? That right now it is true. Let's tell it okay. And notice right now my sales were above 10,000. So how did it calculate my commission? It took my 15,000 times 8% and got $1,200. Let's change my sales. Let's make it $5,000. In this case, my sales are below 10,000. It's going to take my sales, this time multiply it by the low rate, the 5%, to calculate my commission amount of $250. So notice that the amount which appears in cell B4 will vary depending upon whether or not the condition is true. Let's do one more here. Let's decide about paying our children for doing their chores. Let's go to cell A1 and type in the word chore. Let's go to cell B1 and type in the amount of pay. In cell C1, let's type in chore completed with a question mark. And then let's go to cell D1 and let's type in amount due. Let's come up with some chores. Let's let them mop. Let's let them vacuum. Let's let them dust. And let's let them cut grass. So let's pay them $5 for mopping, $10 to vacuum, $8 to dust, and $15 to cut the grass. Now we're only going to pay them if they complete the chore. So let's suppose that they mopped. They did not vacuum. I'm going to type in a Y indicating yes, the chore was complete. An N indicates they did not complete that chore. Let's see. They didn't dust either, but they did cut the grass. So they did mop. They did not vacuum. They did not dust. They did cut the grass. In cell D5, let's calculate the amount that we owe them for completing their chores. We only want to pay them if they completed their chores. If they did not, we would not want to pay them here. We have two options. Either we want the amount of the chore to show if they did complete the chore, or we want a 0 to show if they did not complete that chore. Let's go to fx again. I'm now in cell D2. Let's go to fx. All right. Again, if is what it pulls up right away. The first thing we want to do is to give it a logical test. My test here is to see if they completed the chore. Now I am on row 2 right now where I'm writing this. So my condition is going to be if C2 is equal to, now there are two ways to write this. I'm going to write this first off using if they did do the chore. Now if I'm comparing to text, I have to put the double quotation marks around the text that I am comparing to. You'll notice on the last one we did, when we typed in text for my true or false, Excel automatically dropped in those double quotation marks for us. But if as part of our test we are comparing to a text item, we have to actually put quotation marks around that text. So what if C2 is yes? In other words, they did complete the chore. Then the amount that we owe them would be whatever is in B2, the amount of the pay. What if C2 does not equal Y? In other words, they didn't do the chore. All right, how much are we going to pay them? Well, in this case, it's going to be 0. Let's tell it okay. And notice it says for my first chore that we owe them $5. I'm going to take that and copy it down. You'll recall there are a number of ways to copy. The easiest way to copy to adjacent cells is to hover over the bottom right corner of the cell. That's the fill handle. I can double click it and it will copy that formula down as far as it thinks it needs to go. In this case, it guessed just right. Do notice what happened as I copied it down. What happened when I copied it down to row 3? Instead of looking at C2 and B2 in the formula, it now was looking at C3 and B3. When I copied it down one more row, instead of looking at C2 or C3, it's now looking at C4. The same thing with B. It's not looking at B2 or B3, it's now looking at B4. That's because those are relative cell references, as I discussed in a previous lecture. Every cell reference is relative by default, which means it will change when it is copied. In this case, that's just what we want. It's not a problem. You recall that if for some reason we did need to lock down that cell reference so it did not change when we copy it, we would use either the F4 key or insert $signs to lock it down. But this is just what we wanted to happen. The last thing I might do is I might come to cell D6 and let's insert a function to figure the total amount that we owe them. My easiest way to do that is to go to AutoSum, and it says I bet you want to add from D2 through D5, which is correct, and I simply will tell it yes. I tell it enter, and it inserts my formula for me. Let's go back and change some things. Let's say that they didn't mop. Notice that automatically recomputes. They did vacuum. They did dust, but they didn't cut the grass. And do you see how the amount that we owe them will automatically change? Let me show you one more thing over here, which is a different way that we could write this. You'll recall that this is the function we had a minute ago. We said if C2 is yes, in other words, if they did the chore, here's what we owe them. Let me delete those and show you a different way that would accomplish the exact same thing. I'm going back to cell D2. I've deleted what's already there. I'm going to go back to my fx, back to my if function. A minute ago we said what? If C2 is yes, here's what we're going to do. Well, I could word my test differently. This time I could simply say if C2 equals no, in other words, the n. If C2 equals n, notice I put the double quotation marks around that. If they did not do their chore, I'm going to give them 0. But, okay, what if this condition is false? In other words, if C2 is not equal to n, in our case, that means what? C2 would have to be equal to y. How much do we owe them then? Well, we owe them the $5 found in B2. All right, notice I can take that, copy it on down. We're not paying them for mopping because they didn't do it. We are paying them for vacuuming. We are paying them for dusting. And we are not paying them for cutting grass. So notice if function was used in two different ways to accomplish the same thing. In the first case, my condition was if C2 equals y. In other words, if they did do the chore, then I gave them what's in B2, otherwise I gave them a 0. The way we did it now is we said if C2 equals n. In other words, if they did not do the chore, if that test is true, we're going to give them 0. But if it's not true, in other words, they did do the chore, then I give them the amount that they earned. Two different ifs that accomplish the exact same thing. One is not right, one is not wrong. They both are perfectly acceptable. So you'll see that with many ifs, there's more than one way to write the if, and it depends upon the way that you set up the condition. But the most important thing to remind you, and let's just review the three parts of the if one more time. The first part is the logical test, and that must include some sort of a comparison. Less than, greater than, equal to, not equal to. The second part says, here's what we're going to do if that condition is true. If that test or condition above is true, here's what we want to show in this cell. And the third part of the if says, here's what we want to show in that cell if the condition is false. So the three parts are the first off, the test or the condition, some sort of a comparison. The second part, what to do if the condition is true. And the third part, what to do if the condition is false. Notice again the way I suggested you go about an if is to click on FX and get started. Let me show you. I'm going to click in cell E2. I could actually just type in the if equals if left parentheses. And notice, do you see where Excel tries to help you out here? It says, okay, you need to tell me the test. You need to put a comma, tell me what to do if it's true, put a comma, and tell me what to do if it's false. You may get to the point where you write your ifs this way. For right now, I think it's going to be a whole lot better if instead of actually typing in the equal if you go click on the fx again, and I would do that for any functions right now. Okay, at some point you'll become comfortable enough with them that you may not need to click on the fx, the insert function, but it's a whole lot easier to go about using functions in that manner. So I would encourage you to use that for all of your functions. And that is the if function in Excel.